Hi, everyone. This is Sharon Meyer speaking. Thanks for joining. I'm the Integrative nutritionist for the Institute for Health and Healing. And clearly today's topic is a popular one. So give me a second and we'll begin. So would you please keep your phones muted until a little later, and then you have some questions, then we will unmute, and then you can ask those of me. Okay, just give me 1 minute, and I shall begin with this. So, okay. So again, please keep your phone. Okay. So here we are. Okay. So about stress eating, all of us have had something like this happening to us in the last, I don't know, how many months is it now? Since March. And it's difficult. I was having a conversation with my colleagues this morning, and we all found that last week was a particularly tough week. And I think if we can just understand that that's where it is, and it's not. And the problem is that sometimes it's not resolvable in as much as how are we going to be with this, what do we do with this, but it's just about understanding what's going on, what's happening to the body. That's what we want to be looking at. So if we think about our stress hormones, okay, what do? So they're involved in so many different functions in the body. They regulate our blood pressure. They regulate our blood sugar and insulin. They're very much involved with what happens with digestion. They're involved with electrolytes. They're involved with our immune system. They're involved certainly with our mood and our cognition. And when we think about stress, there are two responses. We have either the short term, which is the fight or flight, and then we have the long chronic term of stress. So it's a kind of thing of thinking about COVID-19 and everything else that came with it. And it was fine if we thought that we had a short while to endure this, but it's, there's no sight, there's no end to this. And so it gets to be this long-term stress. So the other things that are involved with stress is going to be our thyroid. And our thyroid is involved in many other functions, but we're concentrating mainly on the adrenals today. But thyroid, some of the things that we can see with people with thyroid issues is they gain weight, they are fatigued, their skin gets dry, and there's a myriad of others. But when we think about stress, the hypothalamus and the pituitary regulate our adrenals. And so these are two small glands that sit on top of the kidneys. So when we experience stress, whether it's emotional, mental, or physical, your hypothalamus releases a chemical signal to the pituitary. And the pituitary, in turn, signals the adrenal glands, which respond by releasing a ton of hormones, a cascade of hormones, as they say. And these are your stress hormones. So our stress hormones are adrenaline and noradrenaline, also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine, dopamine and cortisol. So the thing about stress is whether it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad stress, they're involved two parts of the nervous system, and one is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is involved in the fight or flight, right? And then the parasympathetic is after the fight or flight, the rest and digest. So these are two parts of the nervous system, but the whole problem about the fight or flight is that it can continue, right? So it's not like when we're in the veldt or the savannah, where the zebra sees the lion and it runs for its life, and all of these hormones are cascading through the zebra's life, through the zebra's body, right? And then once it's got away from the danger, it starts grazing again, and forgets about that. The problem with us is that we activate that that fight or flight, and then it continues through the course of the day. And maybe the following day, maybe through the night, so our sleep gets disrupted, and all of these things happen with the body. So how do we deal with this? So we really got to recognize the stress, Am I tired? Am I anxious? Do I have deadlines to meet? Am I overwhelmed? Am I lonely? Am I bored? My day's been tough. I need a reward. I'm afraid. I'm tired. So we just gently want to recognize that stress. We might even want to name it. We might want to say, oh, there's anxiety, or there's boredom, or there's fatigue, and just acknowledge how you're feeling. Because if we don't, we end up stuffing or covering up that emotion right now. And we stuff it, and we might stuff it with many different things. Some people will stuff down those feelings with food or alcohol or drugs or any other ways we medicate ourselves. But, as we're talking about food, we probably want to be watching what we do with that kind of food, right? So if we're thinking about adding too many things. As we're talking about food now, and we know one of the things that we've used has been sugar and refined carbohydrates. So we know for a fact the data and the research has been very good at recognizing that sugar is more addictive than cocaine. So it's a drug. We're still dealing with a drug, right? So we want to be. And when we talk about sugar, we're also referring to refined carbohydrates. So carbohydrates that are devoid of fat, fiber, and protein. And they act similarly to sugar. One of the things that happens with this stuff is that they also elevate our stress hormones. And then that is linked with leaky gut. So remember, we have 70 to 80% of the immune system in the gut. So if we are having high refined carbohydrates and sugar and we're extremely stressed, that impacts the immune system at the gut wall, but it can also promote inflammation at the gut wall. So you've got this whole activity going on at the digestive system or at the gut wall. And now you've got things that are passing through that gut wall into the bloodstream. But before it goes through there, the immune system's reacting to those foods and causing a cascade of issues and also hormonal imbalances throughout the body. We also know that if you have an upregulation of too many of these hormones or too much sugar and refined carbohydrates, it increases anxiety because now you've got your blood sugar all over the place. Remember, if you eat something like a bagel, I'm always jumping on the bagel story, right? So you eat a bagel that doesn't have much protein, fiber, or in fact has no protein and no fiber, breaks down very quickly, releases into the bloodstream, raises your blood sugar. Insulin grabs that glucose or that sugar and packs it away, and then your blood sugar crashes. Then you start looking for something else. Maybe it's a cookie this time. Does the same thing, breaks down very quickly, raises your blood sugar. Insulin gets secreted and it takes that glucose out, packs it away, and then your blood sugar crashes. So when we see that elevation of blood sugar and then crashing the highs and the lows of that, it really impacts many functions in the body. And we know it can promote anxiety, depression, all of those aspects because it affects the brain so much. The other thing, too, is that when we're eating those foods, it also is linked with fatigue. And coming back to the brain, certainly poor focus and memory. And then weight gain, particularly around the middle. So we have a lot of cortisol receptor sites in the gut. And so when we are eating those refined carbohydrates, they are stimulating those cortisol receptors too. There's a whole thing between insulin and cortisol. So we want to watch how that works, right? And when patients tell me that they're very stressed, one of the things they'll say to me, Sharon, I just look at food and gain weight. Just looking at the food seems to increase the weight around my middle. So there's definitely that correlation. So how do we do this? Again, we need to understand what are those emotions. We need to name those emotions and find different ways for coping, folks. It might be a cup of tea. It might be we increase the proteins, the fats, and the vegetables. Even though we might be having those sweet things, we might want to just increase the proteins and the fats and the vegetables first. We might want to choose some better carbs. Go for the root vegetables, maybe something like some sweet potatoes or even potatoes, normal potatoes. Just make sure they're not the fried potatoes, right? Like French fries. But those would be better to start off with rather than going for things like pasta, pizza, breads, cookies, cakes, all of those, even candy that don't serve us well. The other thing that we also know is that when we're eating those foods, so we know now that they affect all our stress hormones, they also are linked with metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is a compilation of risk factors. So that's like an increase in your A1C or your glucose, elevated triglycerides and LDLs, lowered HDLs, an increase in the waist to hip ratio. All of those are linked to cardiovascular health, and sometimes not in a good way. So metabolic syndrome can also be elevated. So you start to see this whole inflammatory cascade through the entire body. So the way we deal with this first is let's name the stress and find different ways of dealing with it. So my recommendation to you is sit down and just feel that stress for a minute. Try and breathe and just name it. If it's anxiety, well, I'm feeling anxious. What's causing that anxiety? Can I do something about it? What am I doing with the anxiety? Am I eating for anxiety? Am I eating because I'm overwhelmed with lots of work to do? Am I eating because I'm not meeting those deadlines? Can I find different ways to deal with my stress? Because adding the refined carbohydrates and the sugar and also the alcohol is not going to be helpful. So we need to find a way where we actually stop, take a breath, and just reassess where we are. Easier said than done, but if you do it in small bites, it's going to be something you can continue doing.